I'm here to talk about important farmland soils and try to explain to folks what that is and what it means from the perspective of land preservation. Um, by way of introduction, again, Al Averill. I am working under a Natural Resources Conservation Service American Farmland Trust partnership to help municipalities recognize lands within their boundaries that are suited for agriculture that are not otherwise recognized. And the reason for that is to expand eligibility for funding to preserve those lands. And I'm going to talk about a bunch of things that I've got to try to get everybody on the same page here. So in talking about farmland of local importance, there's several things that folks need to understand to get a good understanding of what this is all about. The concept is really quite simple, but as with all programs, there's a bunch of terminologies and alphabet soup and so forth that you have to kind of be familiar with. So you're going to see on this one slide, there's some terms or phrases that are underlined. And so what is farmland of local importance? Really, it's just a list of soil survey map units. And folks are probably asking, what the heck is a soil survey map unit? But we'll get into that. All of these things I'll explain that have evidence of suitability for crop production within a locality, but they're not classified as important farmland soils in the soil survey. And what's the soil survey? We'll talk about that a little bit too. But the important thing is that once these are recognized, they can be considered for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service Agricultural Land Easement Program funding eligibility. So in a nutshell, farmland of local importance equals increased preservation potential. Okay, so there's this program that's administered by the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. If anybody out there doesn't know what NRCS is, it's a conservation agency within the USDA that primarily works with producers and farmers to help them implement conservation practices to keep soil on the ground and keep it from washing into waterways. So they do this, NRCS does this by providing technical and financial assistance. And there's a wide variety of expertise that's associated with NRCS. I worked with NRCS for 40 years as a soil scientist. I was one of the people who drew squiggly lines on aerial photographs and dug holes. My last position was as state soil scientist covering Massachusetts and Vermont. And I'm doing this part-time in my semi-retirement. I want to point out that there are 2 NRCS employees on board with this presentation in the audience, and that's Stephanie Wilson and Rita Thibodeau, and they have great familiarity with these programs. So if you have questions later, they're on board really to help me in case there's some nuance about programmatically that I can't answer your questions. They were kind enough to dedicate their Saturday morning to help out. So there's this program called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, also known as ACEP. And under ACEP is this thing called the Agricultural Land Easement Program, or ALE. That's a pretty easy acronym to remember if you liked brew, if you like beer and good lagers and things. And ALE might be a way to remember the Agricultural Land Easement Program. And under this program, the NRCS provides 50% of the purchase of an easement. So if a landowner is interested, a farm landowner is interested in trying to keep the land in agriculture and is faced with the decision of, well, I need to get some monetary value out of this land, and I want to keep it in agriculture. I'd rather not sell it, off to turn it into some other use, whether a development or what have you. The ALE program provides 50% of the market value of the land less the agricultural value of the land in exchange for the insurance that the land will, the agricultural value of the land won't be compromised. It's important for people to understand that this is a partnership program. NRCS provides half of the funding. There needs to be a partner entity for all of this to happen. And that partner entity can be any entity that can demonstrate that it can monitor the purchased easement and hold the easement. And the largest partner historically under these programs in Massachusetts has been the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources. And folks seem to have great familiarity with the APR program, the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. But MDR doesn't need not be the only partner in this program. A town can be a partner, a land trust can be a partner. Again, any entity that can demonstrate that it can monitor the easement and come up with the other half of the funding, as well as closing costs, et cetera. So that's what the program is all about. So how does the USDA determine if the land is of a quality to warrant investing taxpayer dollars into purchasing an easement? It uses its own soils information. And if you're not familiar with the soil survey, this is a tool and a product that is available to the public that it provides soil maps and information about the individual soils, as well as interpretations for land use. That's suitabilities and limitations for specific land uses, including agricultural land. And anyone can Google web soil survey, and if you Google that, web soil survey is probably the first site that will come up, and you can play around with that and see what kind of soils are mapped on your lands. But the soil survey categorizes each one of these soil delineations into farmland classes. And there are these 4 classes: prime farmland, unique farmland, and farmland of statewide importance. Prime farmland is based on a set of ranges of criteria that are applied to the soils data. It spits out the list of those soils that meet that criteria. Unique farmland is defined by the specific crop. And in Massachusetts, those soils that are associated with cranberries are classified as unique farmland. And then there's farmland of statewide importance, based on specific criteria that's not quite the same as prime farmland. There may be some criteria that doesn't quite meet criteria for prime farmland, but it is still land or soils really that have a capability for crop production. And then there's this thing called farmland of local importance, which if you use the soil survey, you're not going to see this in Massachusetts. It's actually categorized in the soil survey. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Here's an example of an interpretive map from the soil survey. This is a section of town. This is a section in the town of Hatfield in the Connecticut River Valley. And let me just play around with this a little bit and see if I can't. Whoops. Let me try this again. Sorry, folks. Can folks see my cursor? Can I see a nodding of heads? All right, so the green is prime farmland soils. The bluish color is farmland of statewide importance. And the red color just lumps everything else. It doesn't have a category as important farmland. But folks might be able to see by looking at the adjacent image that this whole area in red on this image that coincides here, this is all in corn. And this is some other row crop. And this area all looks to be in hay. So these are areas that are suited for crop production, but are not being captured in the soil survey as important farmland soils. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I could give you a whole other presentation on that. So we won't go there, but just suffice it to say that the soil survey does a good job as a general land use tool, land use planning tool, but doesn't catch everything. And there's lots of reasons for that. So I'm just a question to folks, what's the minimum extent of important farmland soils to qualify for AL funding? Does anybody know? Well, we're not doing a question and answer right now, but I'll let you know that a parcel of land must be comprised of at least 50% important farmland soils to qualify for agricultural land easement funding. So this category of farmland of local importance can be important. And this is what it says in the Code of Federal Regulations. And I'm sorry to bore you with this, with just throwing up a slide with a statement like this on it, but it's important. In the code, the NRCS is a federal agency, and as such, it must follow federal rules. And there's a section in the code that talks about important farmland, and it describes prime farmland, unique farmland, and farmland of statewide importance. And it goes on to talk about farmland of local importance. And this is the entirety of the description of farmland of local importance in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's a couple of important things to take from this description. It has to be suited for the production of a food, feed, fiber, forage, and or oilseed crop, even though these lands are not identified as having national or statewide importance. That national or statewide importance refers to prime farmland, unique farmland, and farmland of statewide importance. And here is the kicker, this next statement. Where appropriate, these lands are to be identified by the local agency or agencies concerned. What does that mean? What's a local agency or agency? So it's not really defined in the Code of Federal Regulations. NRCS in Massachusetts interprets this to state that that a locality is a town, and a local agency or agency is any entity, any official or duly recognized entity within the town that is concerned with open space and agricultural land, or that otherwise represents the values of the town. All right, so hopefully the story is being pieced together here, that farmland of local importance is land that's suited for crop production, but it's not recognized in the soil survey, and a locality has to recognize it. So what's this initiative about? Why am I being asked to do this? Well, it's to increase the long-term potential for farmland preservation program eligibility. The more lands that are suited for crop production that are recognized increases the possibility that some of those lands may be eligible or meet that magical 50% threshold for farmland protection under the ALE funding, under the Agricultural Land Easement funding. I also want to point out that when a town recognizes these lands, it is providing an alternative for the landowner. So this is a whether folks agree with it or not, Congress has determined that it's a good idea to sustain and maintain the nation's agricultural capacity. And these programs are bought and paid for. And by recognizing these lands, it may provide access for some landowners to that program and to that funding. So that's why we're doing this. So what's the process? Well, the first thing is you recognize that, hey, there's land out there in my town that is producing a crop, but the soil survey doesn't catch it. So that's the first thing. And I've got a definition here. What is crop production? It includes anything that produces a food crop, a feed crop, a fiber crop, etc. And that includes hayland, and it includes a fruit crop or improved pasture. So if a town is interested, how does one start and go about doing this? Well, I put this premise up here. The town or city values open space, agriculture, and landowner choice. I made a point of pointing this out because in my experience so far, what I'm finding is that in some towns and cities, it's not valued, or there are concerns about the tax base and how it might be affected if the town makes this commitment to farmland of local importance. So I'm making the assumption here that the town wants open space agriculture and to provide landowner choice. So again, the first thing is there land out there that is supporting crops, but it's not recognized as prime farmland or otherwise important farmland? And you simply go to the soil survey to determine that. There needs to be evidence of suitability for crop production in order to make this legitimate, right? To be able to recognize farmland of local importance, we have to ensure that the Code of Federal Regulations criteria is met, which means that it's suited for crop production. And aerial imagery can do that. The understanding of just looking at the land use on various soil types and local knowledge can help out with that. The result is just listing those soil survey map units with evidence of crop production that aren't classified as important farmlands in the soil survey. There are some caveats to this, and there are conservation tenets and policies that we need to keep in mind when we are encouraging the preservation of lands that are important for crop production. We do not want to encourage folks to drain wetlands in order to meet criteria for farmland of local importance. However, there are a lot of soils out there that formed under wet conditions that were historically drained. And those are grandfathered in as far as the NRCS is concerned. And they meet the criteria for prime farmland because their hydrology has been managed. However, we might put the caveat on a specific soil that states this is farmland of local importance where historically drained. All of this has to be verified because NRCS is the national leader for the inventory of important farmlands. So there's sort of a quality assurance there. And then it becomes officially designated. And it takes two signatories. It takes the local official and the NRCS state conservationist. So who does what? Again, I'm going to cite the Code of Federal Regulations. Specifically, the locality identifies farmland of local importance, and NRCS verifies. In practice, and this is the reality, most municipalities don't have the capacity to do this, to go through the entire town and look at all the land use and the soil types throughout the town. So essentially, this is what I'm doing. I'm helping municipalities do this. So I'm guiding the process essentially, and I'm ensuring that the Code of Federal Regulations criteria is met. I draft the document and the locality signs off on it. And then I pass it on to the NRCS state conservationist, who then signs off on it as a matter of course. This is what it looks like. You can see there's a list here. In the first paragraph, the Code of Federal Regulations is cited. The caveat about our conservation tenets and policy are placed in here where it says farmland of local importance, qualifying conditions, take into consideration the highly erodible land and wetland compliance provisions of the Food Security Act, blah, blah, blah. And this is important too, I think. Inventories of important farmland soil survey map units do not constitute a designation of any land to a specific land use. All it does is recognizes that there are soils in the town that produce a crop that aren't caught in the soil survey, aren't recognized in the soil survey. It doesn't have anything to do with zoning or regulation. And I just include this slide to show the signatory page. This was for the town of Williamstown, and the chair of the Ag Commission signed off on it, as well as Dan Wright, the state conservation for NRCS. That list is then stored in the NRCS Field Office Technical Guide online, and folks can go to this and see it there. This is where all the technical and policy and conservation practice standards are kept. for NRCS, and it's public knowledge, and it's accessible to the public. And just to wrap this thing up, because I said I would take 20 minutes and I'm pushing 21. If a municipality wants to do this, sometimes I may need help in trying to verify what the land use history is. Sometimes it's hard to tell if a land is hayed or just mowed for a viewscape or for wildlife management or what have you. The town needs to commit to signing off and identify a signatory, because NRCS can't do this alone. If NRCS could, it would, but it can't, because it has to follow the rules. Costs the town nothing, and there's no regulatory association with the designation. All the town has to do is acknowledge that there are soils that are suited for crop production that aren't reflected as important farmland soils in the soil survey, by signing off on the list that I put together, and then trusting that I know enough to ensure that the Code of Federal Regulations is adhered to. So folks who are participating, this is my ask of you. Understand what needs to be done if you're interested in farmland of local importance, and that you can, through your network with your local folks, your select board, your conscom, planning board, whoever, let them know about this, and let them know that they can contact me if they have any questions. So really, that's what I'm hoping to get out of this, is that you have a greater awareness of what this is, and can spread the word, and maybe it'll make a difference. There is a fact sheet that's available on the NRCS Massachusetts homepage. Here's the link to that is here. If you go down to the bottom of that webpage link, you'll find this for more information. And my contact information is here as well. And again, folks, participants will have the set of slides, so you can grab that. You don't have to worry about jotting this down. So that is it for me. And if you have any questions later on, hopefully we'll be able to answer them.
Al, we did have one question come into the chat, and I think we have a small enough group here. If anyone has any pressing questions for Al, you could virtually raise your hand and unmute. But I'll read the one in the chat real quick. It says, for farmland of local importance and ALE eligibility, what if the town's master plan or open space recreation plan or zoning bylaw reference something like the farms of Northwest Anytown or the area west of Highland Road are designated as important agriculturally, or ag is an allowed use by right? Would this be a step in the right direction for eligibility?
There is, in the Code of Federal Regulations, there's a second line in that I didn't really get into, where a town can designate a specific tract of land as important for agriculture, and yes, that qualifies because of that. I didn't get into that because that involves town bylaws and what have you, but yeah, that's another avenue.
Yeah, no, I appreciate. So I'm Alan Decker. I'm the one who asked the question, Al, and
Yep.
I've seen that in some of our town documents in the municipalities here in southeastern Mass. They actually go so far as to call out relatively specific areas of town, or even specific properties like the old Hampton place on Smith Road or something like that. So thanks very much.
Yep, thank you. Good question.
Right. Any other questions at this time for Al?
One for Al real quick. You know, you mentioned that the locally important designation has no regulatory effect. I know that was a concern kind of early on when we started talking about this, both for the siting of certain types of facilities in town, as well as kind of prohibitions against converting active farmland or viable farmland from different uses. Do those come into play at all that you've run into?
10 towns have now established farmland of local importance in Massachusetts, and so far that has not been an issue. Now that's not to say that a town can't create a bylaw around farmland of local importance and in of itself on its own attach some some sort of restriction. But that's, a town by town thing, I would suppose. And I know folks who work with towns, maybe I could ask feedback of you on what is the propensity for putting restrictions on on land beyond zoning and minimum acre lots and that kind of stuff. I suppose it's going to be different from one town to the next.
Yep, there's 351 cities and towns in this state, and there are at least 351 different ways to look at things.
Yeah, it's real efficient, isn't it?
Great, thank you. Well, I think given the time, we can pass it over to Mark.
I think we're actually going over to Dave.
Oh, we're going to Dave. Okay, heading to Dave.
Okay. So, hey, everybody, I'm David Viale. I supervise the Department of Agricultural's Resources Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, APR program, which Al talked about, as well as we have a state land licensing program. Thanks for spending part of your Saturday morning here with us, and to all of you future viewers who are going to look back on this, on video, howdy doody. Thanks for listening in. I'm going to spend a few minutes just doing a very, very brief overview of APR in case there's any folks out there who are not familiar with the program. And then I'm going to give some updates along the way, as well as hopefully give some information that I've heard through my experience are common misperceptions or misunderstandings about our program. And the goal here is really to help people sort of maybe reframe what they knew about farmland protection potential through our program by giving some of those updates and clarifying some things, both on eligibility as well as compatibility. And then just make you aware of several initiatives that are happening right now that are going to continue the dialogue. So just because what I'm going to share with you is the state of the state today, doesn't mean it's going to stay that way forever. We're in a constant, reflection of how things are always evolving and what the changing needs and wants are. So you have a voice in that, and we hope that you share that with us. So I'm just going to share my screen and get into it. I'm going to take my video off in case that helps with bandwidth. So here we go. Let's see, share screen. I'll do full screen mode. Can I get a thumbs up on views from? Yep, perfect. Thank you. All right. So again, this is what I'm going to talk about. Very brief overview of the APR program to help you guys understand the basics, give you some updates, and then, as I call them, mythbusters, just to help dispel some common misunderstandings. And just so you know, this presentation does have live links to a lot of the things I'll be talking about. So for example, that APR program in the upper right-hand corner will take you to our webpage. So real quick, APR basics. APR stands for Agricultural Preservation Restriction. At this point, the program's over 40 years old, and it's really intended to conserve farmland and to try to keep it affordable for farmers. How do we accomplish that? Primarily, we do it through the purchase or acceptance of donations of APRs. But one thing that maybe isn't as popularly known is that we also do approve what we call private APRs, which is basically a restriction that's held by a different entity other than the state. So maybe it's a land trust or maybe it's a town. So it's very similar to a CR that just focuses on agriculture. The only difference between the APRs we hold and the APRs that we approve that other folks hold is the APR program can't provide funding to the private APRs. So I just want to make sure that people are aware that there is that option for APRs, that you don't have to go through our program. So to date, we've protected over 930 farms, and that we add to that by about 10 or 15 farms per year. and we've accumulated over 70,000 acres of protected farmland. We do accept applications at any point in the year, and we certainly encourage them early in advance to help work out project logistics. Come June 30th of each year, we take all the applications that we have in hand and we rank them. So we sort of accept applications anytime, but we do rank them currently on a once per year basis. Eligibility is very bare bones, in my opinion. If the property has to be 5 acres or more, it has to have been commercially active in agriculture for the previous 2 years or more. And then there's this sort of low benchmark for gross sales where you have to gross $500 a year for the first 5 acres, and then another 50 cents for each additional acre. That's based on the requirements of Chapter 61A. So a couple myth busters. One common misperception is that the APR program has soil requirements for eligibility. We do not. It is not a rule of the program from a legislative perspective, but it has been a programmatic approach to rank soils highly. So everything's competitive. You know, if you have better soils, statewide, prime, or locally important, that's great, but you don't have to have any certain percentage of soils for our program. Similarly, there's no percentage limitation on forest land. Commercial forestry is defined as an agricultural or technically a horticultural use that's allowed through the APR program. So that's an option. However, traditionally we have ranked open land, non-forested land higher. So, that maybe is what leads to that misperception or misunderstanding. And then finally, ASAP-AL program, which Al talked about, the NRCS program, they do have a forest percent limitation, roughly 66% maximum. And since we partner with them closely, that might be where some of that misunderstanding is coming from. Some real quick basics on the restriction terms. Again, the Commonwealth holds the APR restriction for those that we provide money towards. For those particular restrictions that we provide money for, we cannot allow a nonprofit to be co-holder, but a municipality can, and that comes from the Mass General Law. So maybe that's something that, who knows, might change in the future. We partner very closely with the NRCS on the vast majority of our projects, and for those projects, the NRCS has a third-party right of enforcement to the restriction. We do pretty much on all our modern APRs obtain an option to purchase at agricultural value, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We also require that commercial agriculture or horticulture be continued on the property. Currently, in recent times, we do not include residential dwellings in the APRs, but it does allow for approval of labor housing. And there is a 2% impervious limitation on our federal projects, but there is potential to get a waiver for that if NRCS approves it for the federal projects. From an APR, strictly APR perspective, our requirement is it has to be a maximum of 5% impervious or 5 acres, whichever is less. We also do allow for non-agricultural uses, such as, somebody wants to host a festival on the farm, for example, to generate some additional income. That does require a special permit that's approved by the department. And if there's a co-holder, the co-holder also has to approve it. The update here is this is one of the initiatives that we're really taking a hard look at, just to try to see if we can create flexibility for farmers to help them maintain viability by being able to do some income generation that's not specifically agriculture, but still also protecting the resource. So APR basics on funding. Traditionally, our program provides up to 50% of the appraised value of the restriction. The updates here, which we're really excited about, is it used to be a maximum of 10,000 an acre, or if it was a critical resource, we would bump it up to a maximum of 20,000 an acre. We just very recently increased those to 17,000 and 34,000 an acre. So hopefully that'll help in those higher value regions of the state to become a more attractive program. FYI, we also do pay for a lot of the due diligence that's typically associated, such as doing a title examination, baseline documentation report, environmental assessment, and we pay 100% of all those. And then we also pay for 50% of the boundary survey. The remainder of the funding has to be leveraged from a non-MDR source. And again, that's not a legislative requirement, so maybe that'll change at some point in the future, but that's been the historic programmatic approach. Traditionally, the way that we reach that is through partnering with the NRCS and their ASAP-ALE program. As Al mentioned, they can provide up to 50% of the funding. So if you match our two programs, there you go. You've got pretty much all the project costs covered. But it can also be met by another source if for some reason the project isn't a good fit for the ASAP-ALE program. And so if you've got projects that are in that category, come talk to us. We will consider those on a case-by-case basis. Some other things, we do require a local match. Historically, that used to be as high as 20%, but the update is we just very recently reduced that to a maximum of 10%, which can even be further reduced to 5%. And the way that works is, and that has to be, that can be included as part of the 50% that's non-MDR money. And the way that works is if your project appraises out above 17,000 an acre and you're eligible to go up to 34,000 an acre, it's a flat out 10% required match. If it's 17,000 an acre or less, you have the opportunity to reduce that from a 10% local match down to 5% if there's a right to farm bylaw that's been established in that community. And the local match can be any combination of cash or in-kind contributions that come from a non-state or federal entity. So it can come from a town, a land trust, some other nonprofit, perhaps a bargain sale component from a landowner. And just to give some examples of the in-kind matches that you can do is you can work with us to do an appraisal, a survey, a title exam, environmental site assessment. Those can all be counted towards that local match. Let's see, I skipped a slide here. So getting to more updates, our regulations were updated back in 2019, and that basically requires that we look at our policies every 3 years to make sure that they still make sense and are modernized and meeting the needs of agriculture. So we'll be launching a public listening session in 2023 for the next revision of those policies. So that's one of those initiatives where you guys can participate and have a lot of input on how you'd like to see the program continue to evolve. The big update from the regulations really focused on APR transfers or sales for those APRs that have a right of first refusal or an option to purchase at ag value. And those guidelines, it established very clear guidelines on when the state has to waive our right and when we have discretion to choose whether we waive our right or not. Here's an update. We have a very comprehensive guidebook on our website, which you can download through the link in the top right corner. It's an A to Z guidebook, everything from the history of the program to how application and acquisition works to the long-term stewardship of the program. So just FYI, that's a really great resource to take a look at. Another big update here is that just in the last calendar year, we closed 15 APRs. That compares to closing 6 over the past 2 years combined. So the point here is that historically, one of the pieces of feedback we've heard is it just takes too darn long to close on APRs. And I agree, that's been the case. But we've been making changes to increase efficiencies and to really shrink that timeline. And so I hope that that statistic helps demonstrate that we're making really good progress. In my perspective, it really should only take about 18 months from application to close. And I think we're pretty much there. So the updates is we're doing our due diligence earlier. We now use purchase and sale agreements that lock in the closing date. So all our partners have a firm date to rely on. And we're starting to work with NRCS to meet quarterly to talk about how we can better mutually align our programs to help speed up the process for federal projects. And then I am currently with my staff working to figure out a way to reimburse land trusts for acquisition assistance so that they can really help shepherd projects through the process faster and get paid for it or reimbursed for it. Some other quick updates. I know solar is a big topic. We did update our solar policy at the end of 2018. The take-home message is if you're putting solar on an existing structure, you pretty much don't need approvals. It's really not a problem. If there's any sort of ground-mounted solar, which would include dual use, we do have a solar policy that essentially allows up to 2 times the ag operation energy needs to be generated from the solar, but it does have to be sited to avoid impact and minimize impact to the ag soils and resources, which that's something that we would have to approve of. Also, an update or a myth buster, hemp and cannabis at one point was not allowed on APRs, but now it is, as long as there's not a federal interest for the cannabis, right? Because that's still a federal law that you can't get around. But if the federal folks aren't involved in an APR, you can grow both of those crops on an APR. You still have to meet all the other local rules and regulations. So this is another big update, the Farmland Action Plan. This is one of those initiatives that's undergoing right now. We're undertaking a planning process to develop a statewide farmland action plan. The goal is to complete it by June 30th of this year, which is pretty aggressive, I guess, for lack of a better word, but we're shooting for it. So far, we've had some listening sessions and some planning sessions. Things coming very quickly down the road. There is a survey. You can see a link to that in the bottom of this presentation that anybody can take and give their input on the process. We're also doing interviews and focus groups, and then there'll be a third listening session based on the draft plan. So we really do hope that you participate in that process. This is a really good opportunity to advance farmland protection, not only for the APR program, but across the state in every sector. Some other quick myth busters. APRs can be, in many cases, subdivided into smaller farm units. They do allow for that. It does require approval, but that is an option. And that's a common misunderstanding that I've heard. Another big one is on selling or transferring APRs. I've had a lot of people concerned about that process. Just so you know, there are exemptions to it in most of the rights that we hold. If it's a sale or transfer to an immediate family member, or a co-owner of the property or business, that's usually exempt. Or if someone transfers the property through their estate planning, through their will, that's also exempt. We also have an automatic waiver where we have to give a waiver to the sale. If, in a nutshell, if the sale is to a farmer or a beginning farmer who has a viable business plan, if the sale price is at agricultural value, which is determined by an appraisal or inflation calculation, and if the buyer doesn't have any violations on other APRs, then we have to automatically waive. If they don't meet those conditions, we have the discretion to waive or not. Pretty much the only difference here is that the entity can be a nonprofit under certain conditions. We can waive to certain nonprofits that are focused on leasing farmland. And if the sale price is 20% higher than ag value, they can justify a reason why, and we can just decide if that's a viable justification. So again, resale value, it does include the dwellings if there are any, infrastructure if there is any, business value if there is any, and of course the land value. And then on top of that, you can go above those values by up to 19% without us blinking an eye. So that's a concern we've heard from a lot of farmers, is that they don't get back the investments that they make into the land, but it's simply not accurate. There's also an ability to withdraw from a sale at any time. And if we decide to exercise and somebody doesn't like that decision, they always have the ability to appeal that decision to the Agricultural Lands Preservation Committee. So that's pretty much it. I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen right now and yeah, open it up to the group.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. A question did come into the chat, and I noticed Rita from NRCS posted a link that is relevant, but I'll ask it anyway in case there's anything else to add. So what's the current APR program's view of trails running over APR land? Are there qualitative or quantitative thresholds regarding trails' adverse impacts on ag use or soils?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my understanding is there's a broad perspective on public access and trails on farms across the Commonwealth. Some areas enjoy them and want them, and some areas perhaps not. The APR program right now it's an option that we're open to discussing. I mean, everything, as you guys know, land protection projects there's always the case by case basis of what's the parameters of the project. Obviously, you have to have landowner buy-in on that as well. But we have done several projects recently where there have been rights for trails or straight out permanent easements for trails on APR properties. So it's something we look at a case by case basis right now. It's really just looking at, is it going to impact the viability of the farm or not? And so far, it seems like that's something that's pretty compatible if everybody's agreeable to it. But I know that there are people that have very strong concerns about that in terms of how that might impact the farmer's ability to manage their property in the future. And I'm sure that's a conversation that'll continue to happen, and perhaps through this farmland action plan.
Thank you. Garrett had a follow-up question related to this. What about trails on existing APRs?
Oh, interesting. Well, it always boils down to the devil's in the details, right? So you got to look at what each APR restriction actually says. It's a 40-year-old program. There's a lot of APRs that say different things. Your APR isn't necessarily the same as your neighbor's APR. And so, for example, there are probably many APRs that flat out don't allow for conveyance of easements. And so to obtain a permanent easement for a trail, unless that APR is amended somehow, probably isn't an option for many APRs. But again, you have to look at the specific one. Can you structure some other arrangement to have some other right versus a straight out easement for a trail, maybe a license or some other arrangement? Probably. And then again, it comes down to working with all the partners who are, part of that, the landowner, the coal holder, if there are any rights there, and MDR to just make sure that that's something that's doable.
Great, thank you. I did have another question come in through the chat from Mackenzie. What are the options for APR through MDR if a land trust starts a buy, protect, sale strategy? In other words, if the land trust owns, is there a way to go through APR?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Probably something that we need to get our collective heads together and make sure we're thinking about it in the right way. Shooting from the hip, so don't hold me to this. I don't think, as long as the land trust acquires the property in a very careful manner, it doesn't commit them to protecting the property in perpetuity through that acquisition. I don't think there's anything that would stop them from being eligible for APR. But if you acquire the property and the vote to do it says like, we're going to protect this property, then it's already protected in our view, and so you probably wouldn't be eligible for APR. But if you're saying we're going to acquire this and we're going to try to protect it, but we're not guaranteeing it, and if our effort isn't successful, we're going to sell it and maybe it gets developed, then maybe that'll work. So I think the buy, protect, sell is a really exciting option that we'd love to have more conversations about.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Dave? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'd like to know if there of the difference, if any, between the right to purchase at agricultural value and the option to purchase. Am I saying it right? No, the right of first refusal and the option to purchase at agricultural value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are differences. So when the program first started, we started with the right of first refusal. So most of those are on older APRs from the 1980s. And then somewhere in the early 90s, I think we started implementing the option to purchase at ag value. The right of first refusal, there's no limitation on sale value. So if someone wants to sell their farm for $50 million, if they can get it, they can absolutely do that. That's really the big difference. The option to purchase at ag value limits the resale to agricultural value.
Thank you.
And just so folks know, we no longer do the right of first refusals. We only do the options to purchase at ag value. And that's been the case since the early 90s.
No, thanks.
All right, any other questions? Looks like a couple others came into the chat. So is there a way to convert ROFR to OPAV?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so, or there may be creative ways to add layers. You know, we worked with American Farmland Trust to add what they called an overlay restriction on top of it. So if there's not an existing right of first refusal or an OPAV, I believe there is a way to add those on if everybody is agreeable to it. And currently there are some of our policies, I think including our dwelling policy for those APRs that have the option to add residential dwellings. Some of the conditions of approvals give us the opportunity to add an option to purchase at ag value. So there are some pathways to do that, but again, devil's in the details. Each case has to be really closely examined.
Right, I think we have time for this last one and then we'll move on to our next presenter. So Garrett says, we used to do pre-acquisitions with placement of a revocable APR and with review by DAR. The revocable APR replicated DAR APR terms and would be converted into a permanent statutory APR when final APR funding became available. Yeah,
cool. I've heard a lot about the former pre-acquisition method and that it was a popular and well-received approach. We're working on one right now with the Sheffield Land Trust. They're pre-acquiring a restriction that they're going to assign to us. So again, come talk to us, give your comments in the farmland action planning and the public listening sessions. We want to increase farmland protection and we need your help to do it. So, you know, the things that we can do to better partner with you all to make those things work better, you know, I'm certainly supportive of and look forward to trying to figure out how to best do that.
Great, thanks, Dave. All right, and then we'll pass it on to our last presenter, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Can we see okay, so you can hear me, that's a good start. Can everyone see the slide up? Excellent as well. Well, it's great to see everybody, and I'm very excited how these presentations are really building on one another. So last but hopefully not least, my name is Mark Wamsley. I'm the Conservation Director at Kestrel Land Trust. We are a regional land trust serving the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts. So kind of continuing the theme of my fellow co-presenters, I'm here to talk about another opportunity to expand your conservation options and tools to better fit the diversity of agricultural preservation projects that many of us encounter on a daily basis. I want to give an important caveat at the beginning of this presentation. Unlike my previous presenters, I am not an expert in what I am presenting on. I think you could more accurately say I've been enrolled in a crash course in the topic in the last year or so in federal conservation programs. So we're really lucky to have some of my mentors in that actually in this presentation, so they can fact check me and also expand upon anything that I miss. So for the past several years, my land trust has been participating in and this is a big mouthful, the Connecting the Connecticut River Watershed Regional Conservation Partnership Program. or RCPP. You can just call it the Connecticut River RCPP. So the RCPP program is a relatively new, but certainly burgeoning program of NRCS, which Averill mentioned before and gave a brief overview. And it seems to be an increasing point of focus for NRCS to help achieve the agency's mission. So my aim here this morning is to give a brief introduction to the RCPP program, again, with that caveat that I'm not an expert and not talking about management of the program as a whole. Talk about what our goals were for participating in the RCPP program, and then give some reflections on the process so far. Where I'd say right now, Kestrel is probably, hopefully, at the beginning of the end of moving our, or excuse me, not that, the end of the beginning of moving our project along. I think we're all closing in at the end of that first phase. All right, let's see if I can get my PowerPoint to work. There we go. So most of us who have worked on any ag land conservation effort know that a big part of the early effort is matching both the land and the landowners' goals to the various available conservation programs, each with their own specific criteria and offerings. In regards to farmland, we've always had a few choices, and we've talked about a few this morning already. In Massachusetts, we are blessed to have the APR program, which for years has worked quite well for productive farms. And I actually had a note here saying productive farms with good soils, and I'll go back to what Dave said before, that actually, the productive soils element was more related to an NRCS ALE requirement. But since APR and the ALE program kind of work together in most traditional projects, you know, that's kind of been the standard we've been going for. In areas where land values have exceeded kind of the either current or previous APR per acre cap, some land trust municipalities have turned to the ASAP ALE program, the NRCS program, which again provides 50% funding to most APRs. In areas where for some reason the criteria for neither of those programs work, we've certainly seen land trusts go for either an agricultural CR, so just a regular CR that has some agricultural components to it, or a privately held APR, as the Viale mentioned. I think they're kind of along a spectrum, and it relates to who actually at the state level approves those restrictions. And we've certainly seen some nonprofits actually take fee ownership of farms and, you know, have it protected through their nonprofit status and purpose, you know, as some sort of community farm. So in kind of doing that matching, in, you know, trying to kind of fit ag land to programs, I think a lot of land trusts and other organizations trying to do the work will ask the question, will it fit? Will it fit a program? And I kind of get the idea that some people working for programs, some of the program staff are appropriately asking, does it fit our program, or should it fit given what the purpose of our program is? And I want to suggest that the more constructive question to arrive at for both sides is kind of an open-ended exploration of, can it fit a certain program? And the RCPP program, at least as I understand it, is really starting to bridge that distinction. So how does it do that? I think it really does it, again, from my observations, by allowing partners with NRCS to identify regional conservation priorities and projects that address natural resource challenges on ag land. So it really kind of, in some ways, puts the partner in the driver's seat to kind of take the initiative. It also allows partners to propose program innovations to increase, you know, the flexibility and impact of the project. Very often that is achieved through something called an adjustment of terms, or AOT. I want to talk about that a little bit more in future slides. It also allows partners to co-invest in projects with NRCS directly, giving both financial assistance and technical assistance to make the projects move forward, with NRCS providing, at least for ALE projects, you know, RCPP is bigger than ALE, But for the ALE project that I'm working on right now, certainly it's up to 50%, which again was mentioned earlier by Al. And I think one of the big other advantages of the RCP program is, with the partners' help, it allows us to secure a funding pool for these projects that can be applied on a regional level with some degree of kind of partial partner control and discretion of, what projects are being put forward and championed. So again, kind of bridging that gap in terms of allowing kind of some of the private land trust partners and other partners on the ground to try and, figure out, can these projects work within a federal program? Now, I have to stress that the RCP program has changed dramatically since its inception. And it's even changed a lot during the time that the Connecticut River RCPP has been in existence. As you can see here, the program was first authorized in 2014, the 2014 Farm Bill, and it's had a good amount of success nationwide from there. Some of the big changes, again, and I've taken this, off the NRCS's website for the RCPP program, and we've certainly been encountering this a little bit. It's now a standalone program in NRCS with $300 million in annual funding. A big change, again, from when we first applied to the RCPP program and the RCPP program now. Before, we were applying for some of the existing types of easements that were in, run by the NRCS program. ALE easements, wetlands reserve easements, that is changing with the new Farm Bill. There are now going to be RCPP easements. And I guess there's some question about what those are going to look like. Things are in process right now. But for our project, we are still working with WREs and ALEs. Partners for the RCPP program can apply either to critical conservation areas, which have already been established by NRCS, or the state or multi-state funding pool. So just kind of different options for the scale and kind of geographic focus of what you can apply for. And lastly, I think an important change is RCPP now includes opportunities for projects that specifically address climate change and benefit historically underserved producers, and also support urban ag. And certainly in our RCPP, we are particularly taking advantage of the change to address climate change in there. So, connecting the Connecticut. I laughed that everyone reuses this slide from the top of Mount Sugarloaf, but I think it's appropriate to start because it shows the landscape that we're working in with Connecting the Connecticut RCPP. Again, this shows the Connecticut River going through some great bottomland farmland, and we also see some of the, some elevation rising in the distance with the Holyoke Range. So back in 2018, 14 organizations led by the Nature Conservancy applied for and received $4.89 million in RCPP funding to use over 5 years, and to focus specifically on aquatic and terrestrial connectivity and climate resilience within the borders of the Conti National Wildlife Refuge, which, for those of you who don't know, largely corresponds with the entire Connecticut River watershed in 4 New England states. And there's a map of the Conti. So practically speaking, when it came to farmland conservation, the partners were really seeking to protect a greater diversity of Connecticut Valley farms in their entirety, including ones which hosted significant wildlife habitat. So these included orchards and pasture land and working woodlands and wet hayfields, which don't often qualify for other programs due to soils, slopes, and forest cover. And related to this, we had, Kestrel that is, had a particular farm in mind that had been kind of a square peg that we had been trying to fit in a round hole for some time. So we kind of brought it to the table once this RCPP was established. And we will call it the North Farms Road Project in Northampton. As you can see in this picture, much of this open space comprises one farm. There are those other kind of inholdings in there which aren't, but we're talking 217 acres in Northampton. By most accounts, it is the last largest unprotected farm in the city of Northampton that can still be developed. There's floodplain farms, definitely, that don't have APRs or other forms of protection on them, but they're in the floodplains, so limited development. This is all area, for the most part, which could have houses on it pretty quickly. So a large 217-acre farm producing corn, hay, and pasture for beef cattle definitely has mixed soils. And we'll see a map in that in a moment. Definitely significant forest acreage as part of it compared to the open land in agricultural production. And I think really importantly for us, and which fit right in when we were crafting the RCPP, this particular RCPP, the Connecticut River RCPP, and what its goals were, it's adjacent to the city's largest conservation area, and thereby part of a pretty important wildlife corridor, which goes from the Fitzgerald Lake Conservation Area in the city all the way up through Horse Mountain, up in kind of the Hatfield area. So again, really significant wildlife habitat that is a component of this farm, which isn't necessarily always valued in other conservation, farmland conservation programs. Here we want to kind of almost put it on equal footing, recognizing the value that ag land can play for wildlife. So you can see in this slide kind of the dappled purple and tan areas of the map on the left-hand side. Those are the prime farm soils and the farms of statewide importance for this farm. We did not get into locally important yet when we made this map, although Northampton has certainly participated in that program with AFT and AL and NRCS, would certainly change this map a bit. But you can see really the prime farmland is clustered on both sides of this one particular road. And there are significant areas of the farm that do not have those ag soils mapped. You can also see over here some significant wet areas of the farm. I believe these are mostly hayed. So obviously you can start seeing, we have a significant farm. We have the last remaining farm in this area, the largest, unprotected farm in Northampton, which isn't really fitting in with a lot of the existing programs when you look at it right now. But obviously it's a very active farm. You see the farm owner here feeding his cattle. And I think this is a great shot, actually, this photo up in the upper right-hand corner. You see one of the more productive fields of the farm in corn, but backing up to this huge wetland complex in the municipal conservation area. So you can see really how ag and habitat can really be married together on the land. And, how do you protect them together? Can you protect them together? And also, how do you protect the entire farm without having to really carve it up for different areas of protection? This is considered by the farmer, and for most people see it to be one working farm. Can you capture it all? So where are we? And this shows us a great view over one of the fields of the farm. This is kind of a big wet meadow that's hayed, and you can see it's been historically drained and ditched. But just, really a fantastic area. So project status in relation to our ALEs for the overall RCPP. We submitted and received an adjustment of terms, and I think the most important adjustment that we received was allowing the ratio to go up to 75% forested land to 25% open land, as compared to 66% 33, which is the usual standard for ALE. I've heard there's some waiver possibility to 730 with the state conservationists, but we even went a step further. And I think that's going to really help not only this farm, but potentially a lot of other Hilltown farms, which a lot of other land trusts were looking at as part of this RCPP. We had the adjusted gross income limits for ALE waived, which is wonderful. I should say, and I'll get back to this point in the next slide, that other adjustment of terms items that we put forth really didn't end up proving useful or didn't work as we expected. Part of this is us tinkering with a program we didn't really understand. And really our purpose with the adjustment of term was really just trying to expand the eligibility to fit to the farms that we were working with, because we wanted to expand the eligibility as much as we can. So we threw a lot of stuff at the wall to see if it stuck. And some things stuck, but it didn't really become anything. I think, again, really the ratio of forest land is really the most helpful thing. And then I think, it really has taken us a significant amount of time to just understand the details of programs and the various partner roles within the program, as we had really never done this before. And then to fit our project within the program. For instance, we were writing the press releases calling for people to apply within the program once the RCPP was established. We have never applied to become an eligible entity to hold one of these easements. This was something completely new for our land trust. Again, mostly we've been working with the APR program. We've been blessed to work a lot in the heart of the valley where the soils and other things fit to the APR program, the ALE program well. So MDAR has been holding a lot of these easements on farmland we've been working with. This is one of the first ones that we are going to be holding the easement on, hopefully, if it goes forward. So what's the project status on the North Farms project in particular? Well, we submitted both our initial application for the project and our eligible entity application both in 2021. And it's kind of been delayed since. And that may not have been a bad thing because there have been some kind of changes to the project since then. And it gave us time to kind of work it out with our NRCS counterparts, how to move it forward. One of the things that really kind of jumped out, and I would suggest that should come to the fore for anyone considering applying for a larger RCPP, is we were confused over what the timeline was for the project cycle with NRCS. So we got all our projects in and they were slightly out of cycle. And the consideration period for one cooperative agreement, I think, had already passed. So again, it caused a delay and we just did not realize it. We're working with kind of a large bureaucracy and programs which we didn't understand and are quickly learning. We also, with this particular farm, ran into a conflict with the MDAR farm viability program. We realized that the landowner was taking 80 acres of the farm, and actually it was that beautiful wet meadow field that we just showed, and putting it into the farm viability program so he could get some funding to improve his barn. We thought we were putting forth a pretty good argument that, both programs, the ALE program and the farm viability program, has similar goals in terms of farmland protection, and they shouldn't, be adverse to one another. And NRCS was open to considering it. Ultimately, it didn't really work, and the farmer said, look, I'm happy with the farm viability program. I want to continue with that. So we had to take out those 80 acres from our RCPP application. So we, working with our partners, posted another application period from the fall of 2021 with a March 2022 deadline, which just passed. And luckily, given that we had applied originally, we determined with NRCS that our application really only needed to be updated. So we submitted that update just this week, got just under the line. We didn't have to hit the deadline, actually, because we already had an application in. So from this point, it's fingers crossed as we all kind of work together and try and move it forward. So one thing that's really interesting, and this really impacted how we, or would have impacted how we approached our adjustment of terms process, which took quite a while at the beginning as we all tried to figure it out. As Al was mentioning, most projects applying for ALE or applying for APR that's trying to, that's using ALE money, qualify given the percentage of soils, 50%, as Al said, of prime, statewide important, or now locally important soils. There's actually 4 land eligibility criteria for ALE. When one of those is the soil criteria, 2 are things that most people don't use, especially around here, historical or archaeological resources or grazing uses, which are primarily, as I understand, used out west. There's also a 4th eligibility criteria, which is furthers a state or local government policy consistent with the purposes of the ASAP. And this might be what the person I think was referring to out on the Cape. So one of the things we realized when we read that, and we checked in with NRCS and we're working on right now, is whether we can qualify based on a municipal OSRP that talks about the value of supporting ag land in the municipality. And now we've layered on top of that the fact that the city of Northampton has had their locally important soils recognized. So that's another, municipal conservation goal, which identifies some of the soils on this specific property. So in our update, we have included both of those, both the updated OSRP as well as the locally important soil designation, as hopefully a way to qualify for the ALE program through RCPP, and we will see how that all goes.
Hey, Mark, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. I just want to note we're 2 minutes over, so I think we really need to end
Okay.
right at 10:20. So we have about 3 minutes.
That's okay. I have
okay.
Just my last slide here, basically.
Sure, yeah.
We should be able to do it. So lessons learned so far. Innovation within a complex system is challenging, especially when you aren't familiar with that system. So you're jumping in, and if you're not really intimately involved with federal programs, it could be kind of like trying to work on your own car when you're not a mechanic and not trained in it. It's great that Al brought up, some of the Code of Federal Regulations, and reading statutes and regulations can really be helpful when you're trying to kind of figure out how your project fits within the broader framework. But at the same time, expert knowledge of the internal rules and procedures of these programs are really involved in project success. I think, it's really been a key to move forward, to work hand in hand with our NRCS partners and figure these things out. Again, with that open mindset of, can this project fit within the program? I think one of the things we've learned is that sometimes there isn't always a ready answer to sometimes critical questions. So patience is key. And this is really no one's fault. These programs are changing, and we're talking about large federal bureaucracies here with many, many layers. Sometimes answers haven't been arrived at yet at a different level of NRCS or of USDA, and we're kind of waiting on that. So sometimes you have to move forward with a bit of blind faith that everyone's going to work together to try and make it happen. As is a problem with working with any program, and this is, again, for people applying, I think it's really important to work to decipher what are hard and fast rules of a program versus what are areas where flexibility actually exists. Again, this is something where working with people who know the internal rules and procedures can really be helpful. So you don't end up hitting your head against a wall on something you really don't have to hit your head a wall against. And lastly, I think we learned trying to take the simplest route possible forward for your project is going to give you the greatest chance of success. Once we learned, the possibility of kind of going on these kind of locally important conservation goals, again, it threw a lot of our adjustment of terms out the window. We spent a lot of time making things more complicated than they need to be. If we had pinpointed something, a simple course of action forward, that's what I think we would have gone for. So again, it just takes time and takes learning. So that's pretty much it. I definitely encourage people to apply for the program. Again, managing the program, applying for the overall program is a big lift, and I was involved in part of that, but not managing the whole thing or submitting the application. TNC was in charge of that. But beyond that, once you get in, I think there's some really good opportunities here to do some really creative things with some really great people. So good luck to everybody, and thanks.